Hi, Mark. Welcome to the EO Wonder Podcast.
Hi, Kalika. Thanks for having me.
I have the wonderful Mark Siebert, the CEO of the iFranchise Group, and he wrote the most phenomenal book called Franchise Your Business, a best-selling book on Amazon, and it's a book that I picked up recently because of one of my other entrepreneur friends suggested it, and he is the person that knows probably the most about franchises. So welcome again.
Well, thanks again for having me and giving me this opportunity.
One of the case studies that you share in your book is about massage envy. Tell us a little bit about massage envy and maybe give a description to it because we have global listeners.
Massage envy is a sort of a pioneer in the therapeutic massage space. Prior to massage envy, pretty much the only place you could go and get a therapeutic massage would be at sort of a high-end spa where you would go in and pay in US dollars. It'd be $100, $150 to get a massage. And what they did is they pioneered a new model where they would provide a membership-based program where people would come in, they'd pay a $65 a month membership fee, and for that they'd get one free massage that they could carry over month to month, and then every month they'd get billed that $65, and if they wanted to get an additional massage, they would get it at a discounted rate. And they were able to get a really great repeat business based on that, and found that essentially what they did is they applied a sort of the gym model of membership to the massage space. John Leonicio, who's the founder there, was from the gym industry, and so he applied that model. It worked out great. Came to us when he first got started. When he came to us, he only had one location, and so we talked to him about it, and we were, very enhanced by very thrilled by the model when we saw it. And when we started work with him, he had just gotten to the point where he's starting to make money. And we recognized that this was going to be one of those races to the finish line. We put together a pretty aggressive franchise program for him. And I think they've got 1,600 locations now. They've been sold a couple times now, most recently to Work Capital, which is a very big private equity firm that specializes in buying franchise companies. And so I don't know the exact selling price, but I was told that it was north of $1 billion that they were sold for. And so these are people who came to me, I think 12 years ago probably. And now they're one location, and now it's $1 billion company. So it's a pretty impressive growth story.
And this is your jam, franchising.
Yeah, this is what I do. So I've got a lot of stories like that. I don't know that they've had as much success as a Massage Envy, but companies like Buffalo Wild Wings when they got started, or Auntie Anne's Pretzels, or Which, or a number of others. One of the more recent ones was actually a medical franchise, a company called QC Kinetics, and they've sold 300 franchises in the first two and a half years. And so we've been on sort of the ground floor with some really fantastic companies when we got started.
So why would a company want to franchise?
Well, really three reasons. In franchising, you are growing with other people's money. So while you are able to grow with other people's money, you're not giving up equity in the process. So it's the franchisee typically makes the entire investment in the opening of a location. Sometimes it's not even a physical location, but if it is a bricks and mortar location, it can get pretty expensive. Second is time. So whether it's a physical location or not, there's a degree of time that's involved in opening up any new location. It could be finding the site, negotiating the lease. It could be hiring employees and training employees. It could be going out and calling on customers. Well, the franchisee does all that stuff. So it saves them on time. And the third is people. It's really highly motivated people running these locations. especially in these days where they talk about sort of that great resignation, you are finding people that are so highly motivated with franchising, and they're long term. You're not going to, with a manager, you might hire somebody and 6 months later they get hired away. With a franchisee, they've invested their life savings, so they're not only motivated, they're committed. They're going to be there 6 years, 10 years. They don't sell it, they might be there. There's in McDonald's, there's some third, maybe even fourth generation franchisees at this point. So those are the three big reasons. It's risk reduction is another one. The ability to bring it international is another one. There's a number of sort of smaller reasons, but time, people, and money are the three big reasons.
And I think one of the biggest misconceptions I had regarding franchising is I just thought that they were just restaurants, because that's right. McDonald's, Burger King, Carl Jr., they're the ones that we see. But you had mentioned earlier that you had a recent success with a medical services company, but there are many service companies that are franchises, like real estate companies. Had no idea until after I read your book. Tell us a little bit more about the franchises that are not restaurants.
Yeah, there's really almost every industry you can think of, there are a lot of franchises. If you look at a lot of the service-based industries, the biggest companies in janitorial services, Jan King, Janet King, Jan Pro, those are all franchise businesses. The biggest companies in maid services, the maids, Mary Maids, Molly Maids, all franchises. The biggest companies in carpet cleaning, ChemDry, Coit, others like that, Rainbow International, those are all franchise businesses. Biggest companies in lawn care, you can just go down the list. Every single business that you can almost think of where they have a B2C, B2B component, almost always you see that there's big players in the franchise space. Obviously, restaurants are very big, but you find this in the medical space, any kind of service space. You find this. All the big hotel chains are franchised, so you see that as a very big segment in franchising. It just has a different kind of franchisee. So you sell a Ritz-Carlton franchise, you're selling it to an investment company. You're not selling it to a mom and pop type of investor. So it's very different. You really see it in really every single class of business that's consumer facing.
What made you get into franchising?
I wish I could tell you a really great story about it, but I just answered an ad and I went to work for a different company and I just fell in love with it. The thing about franchising that I really fell in love with was that every single concept is so different. One day you're working with a medical concept that does pain management, and the next day you're working with a new kind of restaurant that's selling something that maybe you've never had a chance to even try before. And the next day you're working with somebody that, I could tell you concepts that that are just, you'd never even think of, that are oftentimes just very cutting edge or just very, very niche. And you learn so much about so many different businesses that it's a constant education for me, and I think that's what I just really love about it, is every day I learn something new.
And what's also great is that you're giving a process to someone who may not have very much business experience and giving them a livelihood. Is that why people get franchises?
I think the whole idea of being a franchisor is very rewarding. The people who are acting as franchisors are giving people an opportunity to build businesses that are successful. They are giving people an opportunity to employ other people. They're giving people an opportunity to put their children through school and to buy homes and raise families and do all these other things. When you see some of these, you go to some of these franchise conventions and you see how the franchisees, sometimes just literally adored some of the founders of these businesses that have put them in a position that they might otherwise never have been able to achieve financially and from a standpoint of what they've been able to do with their lives and their lifestyle, and really even spiritually been able to help them. I think that what you'll find is that it's just a very rewarding business to be in if you do it right. The key is you have to make your franchisees successful. And I think that's really the overall key to franchising. If you go into franchising and your franchisees all fail, you're going to fail as a franchisor anyhow. But if you go into franchising and you can make the vast majority of your franchisees successful, it's going to be one of the most rewarding kinds of businesses you could ever get into.
And why would someone want to franchise their own business, just like a Massage Envy? You had mentioned that you can scale rather quickly. What are some cons to maybe not franchise?
The downside? The downside of franchising, I guess, is that you don't make every dollar that goes to the bottom line. So if the way a franchisee makes money, or a franchisor makes money, is that they're going to get a royalty that's going to be a percentage of the revenue that comes off the top. So, in the case of Massage Envy, maybe the franchisee is going to pay 8% to Massage Envy, but they're going to make the majority of the profit that would have gone to the bottom line. So if I were to open up my own Massage Envy, maybe I'm making 20-25%. But if I franchise it, maybe I'm making 8%. Of course, I didn't have any investment in that 8%, and I might have had to spend $1 million to open up a Massage Envy. So there's a big difference from a return on investment standpoint. But in terms of return on units, in terms of my unit performance numbers, I get more money from a corporate location, assuming that it's profitable, of course. In a downturn, I've got all that risk. Second reason is that I've got more control, at least from the standpoint of being able to hire and fire when I have a corporate location. In a franchise location, my control is contractual, whereas in a corporate location, I have a greater level of control because I can just fire people. Usually it's employment at will, and I can just say, I don't like this manager, he's gone. That manager in a franchise relationship is an employee of the franchisee. They're not mine to fire. And so I can control the standards, but I cannot control down to the level of employment. I would say those are probably the two big issues. One thing that people talk about a lot is litigation. But frankly, in a franchise world, you get out from under more litigation than you take on. A franchise contract typically is a pretty one-sided contract in favor of the franchisor. It's often given on a take it or leave it kind of basis, with very little in the way of negotiation going on. And so the contract itself has very little margin for litigation built into it. It's written in a way that it would be very difficult for somebody to come back and say that there's some kind of contractual issue. So the issues that come up usually are third-party liability issues, where frankly, if you use a professional company like iFranchise Group to put together things like your operations manuals and your training programs, and you clearly distinguish between brand standards and best practices, you probably are not going to have those kind of third-party liability concerns. Or if you do find yourself in those kinds of cases, they're not going to be long-lived. That being said, if you compare that to corporate growth as an alternative, when you look at corporate growth, you absolutely have liability for everything that happens in a location. In a franchise business, since it's owned and operated by an independent contractor, somebody slips and falls or something happens in that location, technically, under the law, that is the responsibility of the franchisee.
So there are many entrepreneurs that are listening who potentially have businesses that can be franchisable. What type of advice would you give? And also maybe share the process of what it takes to become a franchisor.
Okay, well, so I guess the question of franchisability is really sort of boils down to three things in my mind. And in my book, I sort of go into a little bit more detail, and on my website, iFranchiseGroup.com, it's got more detailed breakout, but there's three real things that we're looking for in terms of what constitutes franchisability. The first is, can you sell franchises? And so we look for things like differentiation. We look for things like, are people or is the concept or the people behind the concept credible? Is it something that's unique? Does it have sort of a sizzle factor to it? How are they positioned in the marketplace? Those things will sort of dictate whether or not you can sell franchises. Now, while there are some companies, I mentioned QC Kinetics, that'll sell 100 units plus in a year, most franchisors don't, and frankly, I recommend that most franchisors start out more slowly. And, typical franchisor, average numbers, these are some dated statistics, but they might sell 9 in the first year, 11 in the second year, 13 in the third year. Those are some statistical averages that date back some years, but that would be much more in tune with what somebody should be anticipating as opposed to selling hundreds. That's not what is typical in franchising. But we want to be able to sell them. That's the first thing. The second thing is you have to be able to duplicate the results. So there are some businesses that just work because of the dynamic personality of the founder, or there are businesses that work because of a particular location. If somebody had a location in the middle of Disney World, that might be a difficult thing to replicate outside of Disney World. It might be that it is a very regional food product. So there are certain foods that, barbecue being one example, where it's pretty regional in terms of what people's likes and dislikes are. And it's harder to franchise certain kinds of barbecue outside of their sort of home markets. You can do it locally, but being a national franchisor becomes more difficult. And then the main thing is really sort of the teachability. So how quickly could I learn this business? So if it takes a French chef to be able to run the business, that's going to be pretty hard to teach that. And how systemized is it? Have we taken what's up here in our heads and put it down on paper so that somebody else has these systems in place and can actually follow those systems? Because that's really, our ability to not only to have the systems in place for the franchisee to follow, but to be able to enforce our brand standards, we have to have those written down. So that's the second piece. And then the third piece is the piece that I mentioned earlier about franchisee success, and that is return on investment. Now, ultimately, it's just like investing in any other asset. If I were going to invest in the stock market or going to invest in the bond market, I would expect a certain rate of return on my investment. And so it's the same with a franchise. I would invest, if I were going to get into a particular business and I was going to be an owner-operator, I'd expect to get a salary commensurate with what that owner-operator would normally make in an open market. And I'd also expect to get a return, the amount of money that I invested in that particular business. So if I invest $100,000 in the stock market, I might expect to get 10% long-term on that investment. If I'm going to invest in a franchise, because it's got a perceived higher level of risk, maybe I'm looking to get 15%, maybe I'm looking to get 20%, or maybe even a little more than that if I perceive it to be a higher risk investment. And that would be after paying that royalty. So it's can you sell it? Can you duplicate it? And is the return on investment, and it's not return on sales, it's return on investment, is the return on the amount of money that I invest going to be adequate to motivate me to, or make me feel as if I've made a good return on my capital. So that's the first piece. And I would say, if you are thinking about franchising, if one of your listeners is thinking about franchising, the first thing that I would do is I'd sort of want to go through that exercise to determine whether or not the business actually is franchisable. And again, there are places where they can go and look at that kind of thing, like my website, or they can sort of go to books, or we're happy to speak to people that are serious about franchising as well. If they are franchisable, then sort of the next question is, do they need to franchise in order to reach their goals? So before sort of jumping into franchising, I think the other thing somebody should do is make an analysis of whether or not franchising is the right growth plan to reach their goals. Because our philosophy is that in order to, a business itself should be designed to reach the goals of the founder. it's not designed to meet my goals or to grow as fast as possible or anything else. It's designed to achieve the goals of the person who is the owner of that business. And if their goals are aggressive, then maybe they need to franchise in order to reach those goals. But if their goals are fairly conservative, maybe they don't need to franchise. Maybe they can open up 2 or 3 more locations and continue to lead the lifestyle that they're leading and be perfectly happy and content with what they are doing right now. So that requires a little bit of introspection on the part of the business owner or owners when they're thinking about, is franchising right for me? And then once they've done that, if they still come to the conclusion that franchising is right, there are sort of different flavors of franchise. Do you want to franchise aggressively? Do you want to franchise more conservatively? And again, that's sort of a goal-based decision. And it's a risk-based decision. How much risk do you want to take on in the process? And how much are you willing to risk in terms of capital? How much time do you have to invest? And when you look at that, what do you need to do in order to maintain quality is a big part of that same decision. Once you've done that and gone through that, there's really 5 things that somebody needs to do in order to be a franchisor. They need to have a good strategy, and that's one of the things a company like ours will help develop. That's things like fees, royalties, figuring out things like who you hire, when you hire them, what you pay them, what kind of service and support do you provide to your franchisees, what does their territory look like, which markets are you going to open up first, second, third, are you going to do an area development franchise, what is your, what kind of communications are you going to have with your franchisees, all the things that will lead to hopefully more successful franchisees. So that's sort of the first piece, and that requires a lot of competitive analysis and financial modeling and things like that to be able to get to a very specific number. Because if you're off by a very small number in terms of your fee and you replicate that mistake 100 times, it can literally cost you millions of dollars. The second thing you need a specific set of legal documents for franchising. Franchising is governed under FTC Rule 436, which requires that you do a particular disclosure document following a prescribed set of disclosures that everybody has to provide, at least in the United States, to their prospective franchisees 14 days prior to signing that contract. And there's a number of other countries as well that have similar kinds of regulations. Obviously, it probably is not productive for us to go through the entire world worth of regulations, but there is a need to develop at least a contract in many countries, including the United States and many of the provinces in Canada. There are disclosure requirements that require a highly specialized lawyer, and that's one of the things we don't do is the legal documents, but I'm happy to refer people to lawyers who specialize in this kind of document production. In some states in the United States, there's also a need to register your documents. It's a sort of separate set of state laws. So that's the second thing, is making sure you're complying with the appropriate laws. The third thing is quality control, and that usually starts with an operations manual. The table of contents of an operations manual is a required disclosure item, or essentially a required disclosure item. And the other kinds of quality control pieces that you're going to want to have are things like training programs and train the trainer programs. And these days, probably you'll want to do training videos and online learning systems and things of that nature that will really streamline the training process for not only the franchisee, but the franchisee's employees. Training and operations and quality control is one of the areas where franchisors can inadvertently create some liability. So again, it's certainly important to get them done professionally. This is where being too prescriptive with your franchisees can create some liability. And this is sort of the whole, falls sort of under the rubric of joint employer liability. So you want to make sure that whoever is developing those documents, and again, this is an area that we help some of our clients with, whoever's doing your quality control documentation needs to understand sort of what qualifies as a best practice versus what qualifies as a brand standard, because that differentiation will determine whether or not how you write it up in your manuals, and will help you to avoid that kind of third-party liability. The next thing you need to do, obviously, is to sell franchises. So that means you need to have an ability to identify where those franchisees are, who those franchisees are, what they are reading, what they are looking at online. How do you identify them, and how do you message to them? So there's sort of a process of researching these folks and developing marketing plans and messaging for them. That, again, this is one of the areas that we get involved in, developing marketing plans and researching who these people are, and then developing the collateral materials like brochures or websites, or franchise-specific websites, or e-brochures or promotional videos or things like that will communicate that message to that ultimate franchisee and sort of capture that franchisee's lead as part of the process. And then the last piece is sort of implementing. It's making sure that you understand how to properly qualify a franchise in the sales process. We talk about awarding a franchise as opposed to selling a franchise, because one of the big issues with being successful as a franchise, or is your franchisee's success, and I think it's fair to say that one of the biggest issues in trying to be successful with any business is the qualifications of the person running the business. So if you find somebody who's stupid, undercapitalized, and lazy, chances are they're not going to succeed. If you know of a business where they would, let me know. I've got a brother-in-law. I'd be happy to introduce him to that business. But other than that, there really just aren't that many businesses out there where that will work. And I can pretty much guarantee you that if somebody comes to a business and they are unqualified, they're not going to say, I'm stupid, undercapitalized, and lazy, and that's why I failed. They're going to blame the franchisor, and they're going to say, Kalika was the reason why I failed. She wasn't, she didn't give me training. She didn't tell me how hard it was. She didn't tell me how much money it was going to cost. Now I've lost my life savings. I'm living in a box underneath the railway station. And guess what? You've got failed franchisees in your disclosure document. The information's all over the internet. And you get several of these failed franchisees out there, and you're going to fail as a franchisor. And it doesn't matter how good a job I do on developing your marketing messaging and your target market. Those kind of people are all going to be listed in your disclosure document. Every book on franchising says talk to the franchisees before you buy. Yeah, if they do, you're not going to be selling franchises. So make your franchisee successful. That's the biggest, most important rule of franchising. If you do that, you don't have to guarantee it, but if you can make most of your franchisees successful, you're going to be successful as a franchisor.
Now I'd love for you to share some successes. We had earlier talked about Massage Envy, but I'd love for you to dive into Auntie Anne's. How did you help Auntie Anne's with their amazing franchise? They sell pretzels, right?
Yeah, they did. I should really give credit to my partner in my business, Dave Hood, on that particular one. So Dave Hood and I used to work together, actually at a different company. And Dave, when he was working, he was the senior consultant who put together the strategic plan for Auntie Anne's. And he was, when he was going out and meeting with Ann Byler, he said to her, I'd like to come and work for you. And she's like, why? And he said, well, I really like what you're doing here. And so he packed up his bags. He went out to Pennsylvania, and he was the first non-family member employee of Auntie Anne's. He became the president of the company. He grew the company to 650 domestic locations, another 100 international locations, and they ended up selling it to a family member who brought in some outside equity, and then I managed to get Dave to come back and work with me when they did. So it was my good fortune at that point. But Dave was really the person who was responsible for the growth of that company, and he continues to work with our clients today.
What's the secret sauce? What was it about them that made them succeed?
You know what? I think the secret sauce is almost the same in many franchises, which is concentrating on the success of your franchisees. You have to have a good business model to start with. So if you don't have a good business model to start with, you're not going to be a franchisable business. So if you don't have a good business model to start with, you shouldn't be franchising to begin with. But if you do have that good business model to start with, the place where people have problems is in not making franchisees and their success the priority. And the things that will trip them up is selling franchise to anybody. And I tell people the hardest job in franchising is saying no to a person who's got a check for $35,000 and is saying, I want to buy your franchise. But it's also one of the most important jobs, because if that person's the wrong fit and they're going to fail, their failure is going to reflect poorly on you. So you have to be willing to say no to somebody that you believe is not going to be a good fit for you. And that's a real important job as a franchisor. So Dave has told me stories about saying no to franchises that were I would say A-list Hollywood actresses. I won't mention the name, but people who wanted to buy a franchise that were names that everyone would recognize. More people would recognize their name than would recognize the Auntie Anne's name. And he said, no, you're not a fit. There's reasons why he said no in that process. So being particular about who your franchisees are and making sure that they're going to be successful, that's an important part of doing that. Being committed to your franchisees. So Ann Byler, who was the founder and the owner of the company at that time, sometimes the mall developers would tell her, I will give you this A mall location, but you have to take this B location and the C location too. She would say, all right, I'll do that. She would keep the C location for herself and give the A and maybe the B location to franchisees, because she was intent on making sure that the franchisees were successful. And she would keep a marginal location for herself, but make sure that the franchisees got the great locations. And the franchisees would do spectacularly well. They would tell everybody else, they'd tell all their friends and about how well they were doing. And they would be, that word would spread about how well they were doing. So, that's just one small way of sort of illustrating sort of the philosophy that the organization had about the success of the franchisees. And of course, I think part of it boiled down to management. Dave Hood, in my personal opinion, is the smartest guy I've ever met in franchising. He's one of the most dedicated guys I've ever met in franchising, one of the hardest working guys I've ever met in franchising. It's been my life's honor to be able to work with this guy. So he was at the helm and leading this company for the better part of 9.5 years. Certainly had a good deal to do with their success. And it's one of the things that I think contributes to the success of a lot of our clients is having the opportunity to interact with somebody who's actually built a company like Auntie Anne's from the ground up. So we're not, the people that I hire are not people that are, out there in an ivory tower somewhere and saying this is what works. Pretty much all of my people come from the background of being in franchises. Our people have actually been in 65 different franchise companies and have over, in our ads we say 800 years of experience, but actually if you count it up, it's over 900 years of experience working for franchise companies. And so when you look at that kind of real world experience, being in franchising for that many years, that kind of experience helps to, it helps people to understand what the nuances of growing a business like that are. And I think that's really what translates into success, is a focus on franchisees, a focus on making sure that they are successful, and an understanding of what is involved in that process, having done it before.
So without naming names, can you share a not so successful story?
Sure. One of my clients is Blockbuster Video. We did some work with Blockbuster some years ago, I think that they were, most people would look at them as being very successful. The business model changed. They actually had a chance to buy Netflix and decided that Netflix was not the wave of the future. And more recently, the Netflix share price seems to have gone down. So maybe, who knows? But I think there's maybe one Blockbuster store left out of 6,000. So one of the things that can go wrong with the business model is that the business model can change, right? So that can be a problem. In the not sharing names department, I've had, and really there's three things that go wrong with franchise companies, and concept is one. That's the first thing that I'm going to. The second thing that can go wrong is capital. We had a company one time that had a substantial private equity investor, and this dates back to the dot-com bubble. They were in sort of the dot-com space, and they were great guns, and they decided to franchise. They were ready to go, and they was basically an internet website building business, and they got right to the beginning, right to the starting line, and suddenly the bubble burst, and they lost their capital and pulled the plug, and it went away. So that was a second one. The third one, and I'm going to point to two different third ones. One of the third ones was one where it was a management issue where, and I'm not going to name names on this one, but it was a company where they were having a hard time selling. And in this case, I worked with the person who was doing the franchise sales personally. And every week I was having conference calls with him, and I was talking to him and saying, tell me what's going on. Tell me about the people that you're talking to. Let's do some role playing. And after about 6 weeks of doing this, I'm like, this guy is just not a good salesperson. And as much as he was a nice guy, he just wasn't cut out for the role. And so I called up his boss. I said, you've got to fire this guy. And she said, I can't. He's my husband. And I said, I don't care. I said, if you want to sell franchises, this can't be the guy. And so she didn't fire him, and I don't think they ever sold a franchise. She could have put him somewhere else, but that's a management issue where sometimes hard decisions have to be made. And I can tell people sometimes where those hard decisions are, but I can't force them to make them. And that's one. And then the other issue, and this is a company that I also won't name names, but they sold and opened a large number of franchises very quickly. And this is sort of the flip side management issue, and this is the one where I mentioned before that growing really aggressively has some increased risk. They sold I think 60 franchises in the first year. It was definitely more than 50, but they weren't able to secure the kind of locations that made the first several locations successful, because it was they were looking for sort of lifestyle center type locations, and they were forced to take locations or recommend or accept locations for the franchisees that were in sort of secondary and tertiary kinds of locations. And their speed of growth, combined with not having the kind of, so it was a very well-received concept. But they didn't have the team in place to be able to grow as fast as they wanted to. And then they started taking some locations that were not the kind of locations that they should have taken, led them to make some poor management decisions relative to accepting bad sites. And because they did that, their speed of growth actually caused them to sort of crash and burn, as opposed to using that speed of growth to their advantage. So sometimes when you have these companies that sell franchise very quickly, you have to be very careful about their ability to execute. So when we talk about sort of the franchise sales cycle, we sort of have a circular cycle that we use. And if you think of it like the face of a clock, on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we've got the things that help you sell franchise, and that's going to be: do you have a good concept? Do you have a good structure to the concept? Does it make good money? Do you have a good marketing plan? Do you have good messaging? Do you have an adequate lead spend? And do you have a good sales process? That's going to allow you to sell franchises. And the only thing that's really a variable there is how much money you spend on advertising. The more money you spend, the average cost to sell a franchise is about $7,000 to $10,000. The more money you spend on the franchise marketing process, the more franchises you sell. And it's pretty much like any kind of numbers game in any kind of sales business. But the back half of that funnel, where you go from, on that same clock face, where you go from 7 to 12, is what kind of support do you provide your franchisees? What do you do from the standpoint of site selection, lease negotiation, grand opening support, initial training, on-site support, ongoing training, communication, all of which leads to franchisee success, which leads to franchisee validation, right? So at the top, starting at number 12 again, is: do you have a good concept? Well, if all the things on the back half of your circle bring you up to number 12, which is, maybe you have a good concept at the corporate level, but all your franchisees are failing. If all your franchisees are failing, then the perception from the outside is you don't have a good concept, and the whole thing falls apart. So what I tell people is the 1 through 6 side of that clock tells you how fast you can sell franchises. Your ability to support franchises on the 7 through 12 side is the part that tells you how fast you should sell franchises. That's your capacitor for growth. So if money is not your capacitor, franchise support should be your capacitor. And sometimes franchisors get a little bit too far out over their skis. They can't support their growth, and that can be a problem. So those are the 4 sort of areas where you sort of see problems in the franchise sales side.
Thanks so much for that. I really appreciate you going through the pros and the cons and what makes someone really successful. And if someone wants to work with you, I know that you also work with a whole team of other people, right? You said that you have people that can help with legal, people that can help with marketing. How can someone work with iFranchise Group?
Yeah, if they go to our website, which is www.ifranchisegroup.com, then they can sign up. We'll send them out a book, our book on how to franchise a business. We can send them out materials. We'll send them out a video, which will basically educate them on a lot of these questions, like things like, should I franchise? And things like, am I ready to franchise? Do I have a franchisable business model? So those sort of preliminary questions can get answered right away. And then if they feel that they are potentially ready, then we're happy to talk to them and walk through some of the services we provide. And to the extent that there are services that are provided by people that we don't provide, we'll make referrals to them. And so we don't take, if I'm referring them to a lawyer, I don't take fees for that. I just make a referral to a lawyer, and I'm happy to do that just to make sure they get good advice. But we can do other things like the strategy and the operations manuals and the marketing plans and sales training, things like that they may also need.
Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation, and you provide such a great service for potential franchisors and franchisees. Your book is incredible. I highly recommend that everyone pick it up, even if you may not be considering franchising now. I think it is such a great book to keep on your shelf and also shared with other people.
Well, I enjoyed your book too. I don't know if I mentioned that. I was sort of surprised when I took your quiz and found out what I was. I figured I was going to be a sage, but I found out that I was a philosopher, and I'm like,
wow,
how could that happen? But
wow,
I was an alchemist too. So that was the other one that was. I felt a little bit better about being that than being a philosopher.
Wow, that's so amazing. So, do you know what the primary and secondary archetype was?
My primary was a philosopher, and my secondary was an alchemist.
Oh, wow. So, I'm so glad that it was a little helpful, or at least surprising.
It was surprising. It's a very interesting read, and I've recommended it to several other people. I'd show the book, except it's in my other house, so I don't have that one handy, or my own book handy at this house.
Oh yeah, we'll show it next time, and definitely put it on social media. But
yours is behind you.
Yes, mine is behind me. But philosopher is great, because what happens with someone who's a philosopher, I mean, like Socrates, Epictetus, like they're so full of knowledge, and they really just want to be able to provide knowledge to other people so that they can succeed. And an alchemist is a magician, so you make magic happen, and those combination tells me
it
that's
sounds
why.
Better when you say it than when I read it.
Well, that's what it is. So as you're saying this now, it's just, you really have a heart to help people. You really want to be able to provide knowledge, because your book was written in such a way that it was so balanced. It wasn't like, come and hire us to be it was not that at all. You were so transparent about the pros and the cons, and I think people really appreciate that. And that's what a philosopher / alchemist does.
See, I read the whole book before I took the test. I thought I'm going to be a pilot and a sage, and then I wasn't either one. And I'm like, why?
It's surprising. It's
Yeah,
surprising,
it was surprising.
Right?
Yeah.
Because you're on the next level. That's why.
I think that people should take the test after they read the book, because
Good.
I think that it makes it more surprising. It makes it more fun that way.
Yes. And then you also realize that you're seeing these archetypes in other people, which is also quite. Like one of my archetypes is a teacher. I had no idea that I, had a teacher side of me, and the more that I add teaching to my business, the more I'm successful, because I do it naturally. So, and just like you too, you're the philosopher. So good for you.
Very interesting. Okay.
Well, thank you so
again for having
much.
me on.
You're just the best. Everyone, iFranchiseGroup.com, okay? Buy the book.
Thanks so much, Kalika. It was very nice seeing you. Take care.
Nice seeing you.
Bye now.